Chapter 1. The Main Principles. There are three main principles involved in what I call memory amplification when teaching mnemonics to students and friends. I use this term because memory techniques do seem to turn up the volume of the mind. Many learners respond positively to this concept because it is easy to imagine their minds as radios, tuning in on a signal and having a volume knob they can turn up in order to increase the receptivity of their minds. After we learn these principles, I'm going to show you how to use them to memorize the Arabic alphabet first, and then how to memorize Arabic vocabulary. All of it is going to boil down to the following equation, which we'll visit again at different points in this book. Location equals word. Image equals correct pronunciation. Action equals meaning. For now, the three principles you will learn in this chapter are location, imagery, and activity. Along with these principles, we will talk about preparation and predetermination. These are ancient principles that have been used for thousands of years. However, it is only recently that I have elaborated them into a dedicated system for memorizing vocabulary. Nonetheless, if you are interested in the history of memory techniques, I highly recommend reading Joshua Foer's recent book, Moonwalking with Einstein: The Art and Science of Memory. Please be advised that this book covers more cultural history than specific guidance when it comes to building memory palaces for language acquisition. But if you're serious about finding classroom methodologies that will directly impact how you absorb, retain, and recall Arabic vocabulary, then you have everything to gain by reading all that you can on the topic of memorization, including Foer's book. Let's now look at each of the three main principles in turn. Keep in mind that each of the principles is individually important, and each is interrelated with the other. Use them independently, and they will still help improve your memory. Use them together, and your memory skills will soar beyond belief. Location. Location is part of, but not the entire picture of the memory palace concept. Locations are the memory palaces we will use to store imagery. They are based on real places that we are familiar with from our everyday lives. The reason we use locations to memorize Arabic vocabulary is because we tend to remember places we've been to without exerting any effort, and this is one of the key principles of memory work. Eliminate everything that you don't have to work at remembering, and build natural associations in those familiar places. When thinking about locations for storing memories, try doing something that I did for myself. I once determined that I have lived in 8 cities, 25 houses or apartments, and 16 neighborhoods within those cities. I have yet to count all the familiar houses that belong to my friends and extended family members, but surely the number is exponential. Plus, the availability of locations is expanding all the time as I continue to meet new people and visit new places. There are even hotel rooms that I remember very well during stays all over the world. Then there is the path I took from a hotel in Paris to the Louvre. The short journey made such an impact on me that it has served me very well over the years. The point is that we all have more territory in our minds than we could possibly ever hope to use for storing memories. The best part is that we can then subdivide locations into individual stations. When you consider each apartment, home, or building a location, then each individual room will be a station within that location. Going through your mind and identifying the countless locations and all the individual stations you are familiar with is not difficult work. It is tremendously pleasurable and will amaze you when you consciously begin to realize just how much geography you hold in your mind. As I'm going to discuss further on, I like to combine indoors and outdoors locations, all places that I know very well. There are some advanced ways that I use imaginary locations as well, and I will teach you these in one of the bonus chapters that accompanies this book. I think that as a teacher, you'll be impressed by the power of location in storing memories, and probably see how you can use imaginary locations as well. However, for memorizing Arabic vocabulary effectively, I suggest that you always use locations that you are familiar with. How can you judge familiarity? It's quite simple. If you can wander through a location in your mind without pausing to think about what room comes next, you can effectively work with this palace. The notion of moving from room to room works especially well because the order of rooms within a familiar building is difficult to forget. Outside locations, on the other hand, can be difficult to remember. In such cases, it is better to use landmarks. Landmarks could include the entrance to your house, the driveway, the yards of the houses on your street, and the merry-go-round and swing set in a local park. You could also use streets in a neighborhood, assuming that you remember them with ease and without having to search your mind for them. If you live in a town with numbered streets and avenues, these can be especially useful because a progression of numbers up or down is concrete. But if you are moving through a park where one tree looks much like the next, you will likely find yourself struggling as you move through your palace. It cannot be said often enough. The more you use places you already know, the less you have to remember. The less you have to remember, the more you can associate the sounds of the words with their meanings in memorable ways. And the more you can associate, the more you can remember. It's an awkward equation, I know, but it all boils down to the fact that remembering less leads to remembering more. Imagery. Imagery is, well, imagery. Mental pictures that you build in your mind. For the purposes of memorization, these pictures need to be big and colorful. The larger and the more colorful, the better. You want to exaggerate the size and colors because the larger and more colorful the image, the more memorable it will be. This will in turn strengthen the associations. Some of the students I've taught tell me that they are not particularly visual in their imaginations, and I completely understand this. In fact, when I read a novel, I rarely see images in my mind. Reading is almost always a conceptual experience for me. In fact, it's possible that I have something called imagination deficit disorder, or IDD. Whether I suffer this condition or not, I do have a low visual threshold in my mind, so I'm able to give my non-visual students a few suggestions based on my own experiences. First, if a student can't think in color, tell them not to force it. Have them try thinking in black and white, taking care to exaggerate both the black and white. Exactly how black is the black, and how white is the white? Is there an opportunity to use gray in some memorable way? Whatever happens, we should never allow a lack of imagination for intense imagery to be a barrier. In the event that neither color nor black and white patterns prove useful to you, try associating certain prefixes with actors or fictional characters. For instance, let's say you are trying to memorize words that start with inter. Interact, intercept, interstate. Every word that begins with inter can be automatically associated with, say, Anne Hathaway, who played an intern in The Devil Wears Prada. I realize that not a great number of words begin with inter, but isolating parts of words is a key principle of effectively using memory palaces to store and retrieve vocabulary until the training wheels on the bike of memory, that is, the mnemonics, can fall away. Another option for non-visual learners is to use paintings. Choose and study paintings that you are familiar with for your memory palace imagery. The more you are aware of the intricacies of famous paintings, the better. The next time you are in an art gallery or looking through an art book, pay closer attention to what you are looking at. Buy books about art history and specific painters and scrounge through them for ideas. Spend time imagining what zany actions these famous figures could be engaged in. The ideas generated in such exercises could become fodder for better associations while memorizing Arabic vocabulary, as you involve the associations with movement. We'll talk more about adding action to your images momentarily. Another idea, perhaps one for advanced memorizers, is to select a number of famous paintings and place these in a memorable order inside of an imaginary art gallery. As you mentally walk from painting to painting in the art gallery of your mind, you can place your associations in front of each painting. For instance, the word interim could have Anne Hathaway engaged in internet marketing, generating the im in interim in front of a painting with an imp. The drawback to this method is that it requires memorizing the order of several paintings with which to make word associations. Nonetheless, I provide it as an idea for conceptual learners and for those who might respond to this approach. I must mention a small problem with artwork, however. Paintings and statues tend to be static. They don't move. That said, if you can imagine the Mona Lisa walking like an Egyptian outside of her frame, or Michelangelo's David doing the moonwalk, then you should have no problem. Finally, you can use toys that you remember. G.I. Joe, Barbie, My Little Pony, Hello Kitty, anything goes. As with paintings, however, the most important factor here is that you can put these figures into action. Without action, the memories most likely will not stick in your mind nearly as well. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to the matter of action. By now, you will have thought about for yourself different locations you are familiar with, sublocations or stations within those locations, and different ways that you can use exaggerated imagery to boost the stickiness of the words lodged in your various stations. The next step is to give your images a bit of movement. In fact, more than a little bit. Just as you want to exaggerate the size and color of your images, you also want to exaggerate their actions. And you want to do so with as much energy, vitality, and zaniness as you can muster. You're probably already quite capable of exaggerating images, but if you struggle, other parts of this book will help you develop this skill, after which point it's just a matter of practice. It's not an entirely nice way to think of memorization, but something that will work wonders for you is to make the action violent. Highway accidents serve as an example of how memorable scenes of violence can be, even in their aftermath. If, after seeing an accident or accident site, you could not shake the memory from your mind, then you know how powerful violent images can be. This is not to suggest that lives need to be lost when working in your memory palaces. Cartoon violence will work just as well. Wile E. Coyote, for example, provides a strong example of someone willing to savage himself in some pretty hilarious ways when trying to make the Roadrunner his dinner. Again, the object is to create something so potently memorable that working hard to recall the image is unnecessary. It will instantly come to mind when you look for it because you've given yourself no other choice. You've made the image impossible to forget. Now, you may be thinking that using this technique is going to lead to a brain cluttered with bizarre images, especially since you already have enough new information to deal with in terms of memorizing the sounds and meanings of your new words. You may experience such clutter in the beginning when first learning the techniques. With practice, however, you will learn to be clear and precise. Moreover, the images used in the associations tend to eventually fall away, leaving the actual memory intact. You'll still wander through your palaces and have a hankering of what the images you once used to memorize a word, but these fragments will be secondary. For example, I initially associated the German word zerbrechlich, breakable, with a vase being smashed by Zorro on an escalator in the Sony Center movie theater in Berlin. But although I remember the word and what it means perfectly well, I never actually have to visit that place in my mind anymore, nor do I have to imagine Zorro breaking the vase. I can if I want to, but because I spent time making sure the image was strong enough in the beginning and did the compounding exercises I discuss in a future chapter, the image very quickly loses importance as fluency takes over. The same principle applies to Arabic vocabulary as demonstrated in this book and to any language you could possibly ever choose to learn. In sum, the new word and its meaning will be the central artifact on display in your mind. If the entire memorization system is indeed like a bicycle, then the images themselves are the training wheels. They are not necessarily meant to stay on after you've grown with the system. The images are the tools we use to install the images, and although we will remember what they were, so long as we continue using the word by reading, speaking, and writing, we reduce the chances that we will need the tools. If you do not like the bicycle metaphor, that is, the idea that you need to adjust each of these principles to your own way of learning the way you would raise or lower the seat on a new bike, etc., another way to think about this is in terms of dental implants. When dentists create an implant for a patient, they not only have to order a specifically shaped screw to drill into the bone, but they have to order a ratchet designed specifically for turning that custom-made screw. Sure, the dentist keeps the tool in case the implant needs to be retracted. But as a dental practitioner, the goal is to do such a good job that the tool will no longer be necessary. But it will be there if needed. When we have all of these three principles of location, imagination, and action working together to memorize foreign language vocabulary, this is our equation. And you'll see how that works with examples in upcoming chapters. Location equals word. Image equals correct pronunciation. Action equals meaning. But for now, let's move on to the next two fundamental principles: preparation and predetermination. Like the full memory palace organization system revealed in an upcoming chapter, preparation and predetermination are two memory skills that I have not seen talked about in any other memory books apart from those I have written for memorizing other languages. Yet both of these steps are essential elements to memorization success when using memory palaces to tackle vocabulary, or for that matter, anything you might like to remember. Preparation, to begin, involves relaxing the mind. I will share several thoughts about how best to relax in the concluding chapter, but for now, please realize that when the mind is tense, busy, or exhausted, it will resist attempts at memorization. This fact does not mean that you won't be able to remember anything. It only means that your mind will not be in the most receptive state possible. But when your mind is open and relaxed, you'll be amazed by how these techniques will double, triple, and even quadruple their results. Even a 3-minute meditation before memorization can work miracles. But see the conclusion for a larger list of possibilities. Predetermination, on the other hand, involves charting out the memory locations and stations before attempting to place the words to be memorized in the memory palace system. I must stress that before you populate your memory palaces with Arabic vocabulary, you should consider building the entire system first, or at least a substantial portion of it. I've tried making up my palaces as I went along, and I can tell you that this leads to little more than frustration and impoverished results. So please spend the necessary time to predetermine the locations and label the individual stations within them. Before continuing, I want to stress that perfection is not the goal with either of these two principles. Preparation and predetermination work best when not forced, so it's important not to harm our forward movement by being too particular about every little detail. We just want to get the basic layout in place so that we can work relatively quickly with the words we want to memorize. Preparing your first location. It helps a great deal to draw maps of the locations you will be using and have some system for labeling the individual stations. Alternatively, students can list them in a Word document or catalog them in an Excel file. You can also easily send a blank email to learnandmemorize@zoho.com, and I will send you free magnetic memory worksheets that will allow you to simply fill in the details. Take advantage of this offer right now because these worksheets will help you instantly organize your locations and the stations within them. All you have to do is fill in the blanks. You'll also get a free subscription to the Magnetic Memory mailing list, which gives you access to helpful tips about amplifying your memory, inspirational notes, links to valuable videos, and other memorization-related materials that will keep your mind magnetic for years to come. Some students I've had like to sketch the different rooms or use computer architectural programs to create digital layouts. Although I personally don't go that far, I tend to do all three of the former in order to maximize the strength of the associations I'll be making. Let's face it, if we're going to spend time learning a language, we want the vocabulary to stay in our heads. Learning grammar is pointless if you haven't got plenty of words to fit into the equations. It's worth taking the time to fully realize my palaces so that they will be accessible when I need them for near instantaneous recall when reading and conversing. The first memory palace I ever created was my apartment in Schönberg, Berlin. It had 8 stations, though I now recommend and always make sure that any new memory palace I've started has at least 10. This particular apartment was on Feurigstrasse, which means fiery street. The name came from the fact that a fire station was located just a few blocks north of me. This was rarely a bother because the firemen had the lovely habit of only turning the sirens on after they had left the street. I don't mention this to be cute or self-indulgent. All of these details come in very handy when it comes to building memory palaces. First, because the apartment was on Feurigstrasse, I used that apartment and every station in that palace to remember words that begin with the letter F. I could use this apartment for any other letter, but this is the association that came to me naturally, and I think it is best to allow for such natural associations. Because I don't have to spend any time remembering that all F words are connected with Feurigstrasse Palace, I don't have to make any odd leaps in my mind searching for words that start with F. Had I placed S words there, then it would take my mind a step to search for which palace has S in it. Don't worry. I'm going to go into greater detail about all of this later, but for now, the basic principle is that every location is a memory palace, and as much as possible, that location should start with the same letter of the words that you will store there. The Feurigstrasse apartment had a nice layout. My office, laundry room, bathroom, bedroom, wife's office, living room, hallway, kitchen. Later I extended this palace outside of the apartment, outside of the door, stairwell, front door, parking garage, sidewalk, used bookstore, playground, fire station, church, sushi restaurant, and so forth. There are 2 important points that I need to mention here. In creating these journeys through the stations of a memory palace, you need to structure your progress in such a way that you never cross your own path and never trap yourself. If, when you are rehearsing or searching for your words, you have to cross your own path, you are liable to confuse yourself. You will find yourself pausing to remember how exactly the journey went, and such interruptions will impede your recall. Therefore, it is best to create a journey that follows a straight line. Even with great experience in the art of memorization, this principle will remain key. Second, It is important that you don't trap yourself. The reason I was able to add more stations to my F memory palace so easily after I finished with my initial 8 is because I started at a terminal point in the apartment, my office. Had I started in the kitchen and moved toward my office, I would have trapped myself, unless I wanted to jump off the small balcony and down onto the street, that is. Making an imaginative leap from the balcony to the street is entirely possible, but it is unnatural and nothing I would do in reality. Thus, such an action causes the mind unnecessary work. The point of this memorization strategy is to always reduce the amount of work your mind has to do in order to get to the associations that will prompt the sound and meaning of the words you want to recall. Therefore, although you will be exaggerating shapes, colors, and actions in your memory work, I feel that it is best to keep the path you take through the palaces as natural and free from exaggeration as possible. Save anything that requires your memory for the things you want to remember and eliminate all else. In each of those stations in a memory palace, I would then place individual words and use the principles of imagination and action to make them memorable. Here's the important equation to keep in mind. Location, station, equals word. Image equals pronunciation. Action equals meaning. We're going to go into that equation in greater detail soon, but for now it is important to understand the basic organizational layout of a memory palace and spend a bit of time constructing one by obeying the principles laid out in this chapter. Try this method out for yourself. Describe the layout of the place you live in now and make a list of at least 10 individual stations. You can make a handmade list or use an Excel file. There is good reason to get started with Excel files right away for the purposes of testing the strength of your memorizations in the future. Before we close this chapter with a list of steps you can take to get started immediately, here are some final tips about creating memorable imagery. Clarity. Make sure that the images you create are clear. I always talk about exaggerating your images, making them colorful, vibrant, and as large as possible. But they should also stand out clearly in your mind. I've decreased the amount of time I need to spend substantially by focusing on the clarity of my images, and also by focusing on how they stand in relation to the memory palace. It seems that the more clear my memory palaces and the more clear my associative imagery, the more the two magnetically fuse together. Precision of detail. It takes only a second to focus on the details. If you are using a chicken to memorize something, what kind of chicken is it? A fat chicken? Skinny chicken? Red chicken? White chicken? Chicken in boots with a cigarette hanging out of its beak, and if so, what kind of cigarette? Can the brand of the cigarette help trigger the target material you are memorizing? There is tremendous magnetic wealth in the details. Avoid relevance. A lot of people I talk to and discuss the magnetic memory system with often try to make their associative imagery relevant. Granted, one should seize on coincidences. They happen all the time during my memorization sessions and work gangbusters for me. Normally, however, it is much better when the images are absurd and have seemingly nothing to do with the target material whatsoever. You could call this the principle of contrast, which is to say that the more the image sticks out like a sore thumb in your exquisitely magnetized memory palace, the easier it will come to mind when you call for it. Avoid logic. This point is almost the same, but differs in the fact that many people who describe their efforts to me put too much logic into the narrative elements of their image associations. They make pretty little vignettes that make sense. I'm sorry, dear memorizer of Arabic vocabulary, but things that make sense are not always sensible. Certainly not when it comes to memorization. Here's an example I heard from a coaching client once upon a time. The Statue of Liberty is leaning down to pick up her torch when Godzilla kicks her in the rump. This is a memorable image, I have to admit, but why is she picking up her torch? That's logical. It sucks the memorability out of the image. Why not have her picking up Salvador Dali's mustaches, or a giant pig with Mount Rushmore tattooed on its flank? Having her pick up her torch is congruent with reality. Having her pick up a piano made up of sandwiches lacks congruency, and is thereby far more memorable. Keep these 4 tips in mind as you create your images, and you will be very successful with your memorization of Arabic vocabulary. Here are some action steps that will help you master the techniques taught in this chapter and give you ideas for how to help your friends and families learn the techniques too. Obviously, you should not be teaching something that you yourself haven't had success with. Number 1. Select at least 10 different locations that you remember well. If you are feeling motivated, you can list all 28, giving you locations enough for the entire alphabet. These locations could be apartments or houses you've lived in, schools, libraries, workplaces, or art galleries. All that matters is that you know them well and can walk around them in your mind. I find that movie theaters with multiple screening rooms work really well for me, and as a film professor I have over a dozen theaters that I'm intimately familiar with. Number 2. Select and list at least 10 stations within each of the locations you've listed. These different stations will become the places you will leave each of the words you want to memorize within each palace. These stations can be entire rooms, which I recommend, when you are just getting started, or they can be more specific. You could use an armchair and then the lamp table beside it as 2 different stations, for instance. Even though you will not need to remember any of these individual stations, that's the whole point, you should still write them down for the purpose of testing the strength and rigor of your memorizations. Number 3. Take a walk through each palace and the stations that you have identified. While wandering, make each and every station vivid in your mind. You can imagine cleaning everything out if you like, removing all the dust and dirt that can get in the way of your memorization process. Number 4. Draw maps. Creating visual representations of each location and the stations within them can be very powerful and save you a lot of testing time later. You definitely don't want to be vague about what comes next in your memory palaces. Again, using an Excel file is also a great idea if you are not a visual person, though doing both is highly recommended. Number 5. Practice remembering trivial things where there is no pressure if you make mistakes. The top 10 highest mountains or largest rivers make for great practice. Shopping lists also make for good practice. Remember to make everything large and colorful. Number 6. Include action. Let's say you're trying to remember that you need carrots on your shopping list. Imagine that you are jumping on the carrot and hurting it badly. You can use whatever image comes to your mind so long as it is over the top, hilarious, zany, and memorable. If you relax, you'll find that your mind will come up with material very naturally. Number 7. On that point, always practice in a state of relaxation. I have included specific notes on the best relaxation techniques for memorization in the final chapter. These relaxation practices are also good for any form of creativity. Number 8. Make sure that you're having fun. If not, take a break and come back to it. When you start out practicing with memory items that have no consequence, you enable yourself to play freely with the concept. If, for example, you start with Arabic vocabulary right away, you risk associating frustration with a language you've always dreamed of learning. Make sure that you can memorize at least 10 items you know nothing about before attempting any words. For example, you could memorize the 10 tallest mountains in order of size, or you could work on one of the bonus exercises included at the end of this book. Number 9. Give yourself an exam. As I've stressed, you need to write everything down for the purposes of testing. This is not rote learning. It's a method of giving you the ability to double-check. Also, when testing, don't look at the original list you created. Write out everything fresh, and then compare the list you wrote out from memory with the original. Number 10. Teach. The best way to truly learn a technique is to teach it to someone else. You should discuss your newfound knowledge about memorization as often as possible, because this will deepen your familiarity with the techniques and prove to yourself and others that these things really do work. It's not showing off to do so. You'll also be making the world a better place because you'll be enabling others to use their minds more effectively. Make working on your own memory and helping others improve theirs should be a habit for life.